Imagine a stretch of water so narrow you could almost shout across it. At its tightest point, it is just 21 miles wide. Two lanes of traffic, each one barely 2 miles across. That is it. That is the bottleneck between the modern world and the energy it needs to survive. And right now, in 2025, the tension building around that little strip of water is the most underreported economic story on the planet. Not because the media is ignoring it, they are not, but because most people hear Middle East tensions and their eyes glaze over. They have heard it before. Nothing happened. Life went on. Here's what they do not understand. This time, the math is different. Let us start with a number. 20%. That is the share of the world's total oil supply that passes through the Strait of Hormuz every single day. 1 in 5 barrels. Gone if that strait closes. Not slowed down. Not rerouted with minor delays. Gone. At least in the short term. Now stack that against another number. 94 million barrels. That is roughly how much oil the world consumes. Every single day. The global economy runs on it, like a machine runs on coolant. Remove the coolant, and the machine does not slow down gradually, it seizes. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a shipping lane, it is a load-bearing wall inside the global economy. And almost nobody outside of defense ministries and oil trading desks is paying serious attention to how thin that wall has become. So let us pay attention. To understand why this strait matters so much, you need to understand what is on either side of it. On one side, the Persian Gulf. Sitting around it like guests at a very tense dinner table are Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, and Iran. These are not minor players. Between them, they hold almost half of the world's proven oil reserves. And nearly all of their export infrastructure, the pipelines, the terminals, the supertanker loading platforms, they all point toward the Strait of Hormuz like a funnel. On the other side, the Gulf of Oman, which leads out to the Arabian Sea and then to the rest of the world. Japan, South Korea, China, India, Europe, the United States, every economy that depends on affordable energy, which is every economy on Earth. That funnel has one exit. 1. Qatar, the world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas, ships almost everything through it. Saudi Arabia's massive Ras Tanura terminal, the single largest oil export facility on Earth, feeds into it. The UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, all of them through the same narrow throat. The Strait of Hormuz is, without exaggeration, the most economically critical 21 miles of water on the planet. Now, here's where it gets uncomfortable. Iran sits on the northern edge of that strait, and Iran has, at various points over the past 4 decades, explicitly and publicly threatened to close it. Not as a bluff, as a strategy. In 1987, during the Iran-Iraq War, Iranian forces attacked oil tankers in what became known as the Tanker War. The United States Navy ended up escorting Kuwaiti vessels under American flags, just to keep the oil moving. In 2012, when the West tightened sanctions over Iran's nuclear program, Iranian officials warned they would close the strait entirely if oil exports were blocked. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, based in Bahrain, essentially called that bluff by parking an aircraft carrier group at the entrance. In 2019, a series of tanker attacks and seizures in and near the strait kept insurance markets in a state of low-grade panic for months. Oil prices jumped. Then stabilized. Then people forgot. There is a pattern here, and the pattern is this. Every time the strait gets threatened, the world flinches, the markets spike, the navies mobilize, things calm down, and everyone goes back to assuming it will always be fine. That assumption is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Let us talk about what actually happens to the global economy if the strait closes, even briefly. Day 1. The oil price reacts before a single tanker is stopped. Markets are forward-looking. The moment the threat becomes credible, traders start pricing in a supply shock. In 2022, when Russia's invasion of Ukraine disrupted energy markets, oil jumped to roughly 30%. In a matter of weeks, a Hormuz closure would not be a Ukraine-scale disruption. It would be bigger. Depending on the severity and duration, analysts at JP Morgan have estimated oil prices could spike to 150 est, or even $180 per barrel in a serious closure scenario. For context, the global economy started showing serious strain when oil briefly touched $147 in 2008, right before the financial crisis. Coincidence? Probably not entirely. Day 3. Spot shortages begin appearing in countries with lean oil reserves. Japan keeps roughly 180 days of strategic reserves, which sounds comfortable, until you realize South Korea keeps far less and several emerging markets keep almost none. The psychology of scarcity kicks in fast. Hoarding begins. Prices in those markets surge ahead of the global benchmark. Week 2. Airline fuel costs, manufacturing input costs, fertilizer prices, shipping costs, they are all climbing. Not because the oil is gone, because the market believes it might be. In commodities, fear is almost as powerful as the actual event. Month 1. If the closure holds, which has never happened before but cannot be ruled out, you are looking at a global recession. Not a slowdown, a recession. The IMF estimated in a 2023 scenario analysis that a prolonged disruption to Gulf oil flows could reduce global GDP by up to 3%. In the first year. 3% does not sound catastrophic, until you remember that the 2009 financial crisis shrank global GDP by about 2%. Here's the irony that almost nobody talks about. The world has known about this vulnerability for decades. The Strait of Hormuz has been called a chokepoint in foreign policy documents since the 1970s. Energy security analysts have written thousands of papers about it. And yet the global economy is, if anything, more dependent on it today than it was 30 years ago. Why? Because diversification is expensive. Because pipelines are expensive. Because building alternative infrastructure requires cooperation between countries that do not always like each other. And mostly because, as long as the oil keeps flowing, there is no political will to solve the problem. Saudi Arabia does have a pipeline that bypasses the strait. It is called the East-West Pipeline, also known as Petroline. It can move about 5 million barrels per day overland to the Red Sea. That sounds like a lot, until you realize the strait handles roughly 20 million barrels per day. The bypass covers 1/4 of the exposure. The UAE built the Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline specifically for this reason. It can move about 1.5 million barrels per day to the port of Fujairah, bypassing the strait. Again, a fraction of the total. The world's backup plan for losing 20 million barrels per day of oil flow is, generously, a 5 or 6 million barrel per day partial reroute, and that assumes the pipelines are undamaged and fully operational. That is the gap between the risk and the preparation. That gap has a number. It is about 14 million barrels per day of unresolved exposure. Now zoom out further, because this is not just an oil story. It is a debt story, a supply chain story, a food story. The world's food system runs on fertilizer. Most fertilizer is made from natural gas. A significant portion of the world's natural gas, particularly the LNG that Europe and Asia increasingly rely on, comes from Qatar. Through the strait, when Russian gas was cut off from Europe after 2022, the continent scrambled for LNG alternatives. Qatar stepped up, as did the United States. But Qatar's ability to deliver that gas to European regasification terminals in Spain, France, and the Netherlands depends entirely on supertankers passing through the Strait of Hormuz unmolested. There's a thread connecting them: Ukrainian wheat, Russian gas, Qatari LNG, Hormuz. Your grocery bill. These systems are not separate, they are layers. And the Strait of Hormuz sits underneath several of them at once. Let us talk about the geopolitical chess game happening right now. Iran is not acting alone in this theater. The Houthi movement in Yemen, which is backed and armed by Iran, spent much of late 2023 and 2024 firing missiles and drones at commercial vessels in the Red Sea. Not the strait itself, the Red Sea, the other critical shipping lane for global trade. This is not coincidence, it is a demonstration. Iran's message to the West, and to the Gulf states is not subtle. It is this: we have proxies, we have range, we can threaten shipping not just at Hormuz, but along the routes that connect to it. The cost of keeping oil moving is going up. Who is going to pay for it? The United States spent years trying to reduce its own dependence on Gulf oil through the shale revolution. It largely succeeded. America is now a net oil exporter, and yet American foreign policy still treats the Persian Gulf as a vital national interest. Why? Because the rest of the world has not achieved the same independence. And an oil price shock in Japan, South Korea, or Germany becomes a demand shock that ripples back into American exports, American markets, and American jobs. You can be energy independent and still be economically connected. Here is what the optimists say. They say the market has priced in a risk premium on Gulf oil for years. They say the US Navy is more capable than any challenger. They say Iran's economy is too fragile to survive the consequences of actually closing the strait. Because Iran exports oil too, closing the strait would hurt Iran almost as much as it hurts everyone else. They say this has happened before, and the oil kept flowing. These are not unreasonable points. The deterrence logic is real. The military calculus is real. But here's the flaw in the optimist's argument. It assumes rational actors making decisions based on economic self-interest in a stable, predictable environment, and the Middle East in 2025 is not that environment. The conflict in Gaza, the escalation between Iran and Israel, the fragile state of the Saudi-Iran relationship, the internal pressures inside Iran's government. These are not conditions that reliably produce rational, self-interested decision-making. History's most disruptive economic events were not caused by countries choosing chaos. They were caused by miscalculation, by one actor misjudging another's response, by a series of small escalations that no one intended to add up to a catastrophe. The Strait of Hormuz does not need to close for 6 months to damage the world economy. It needs to be credibly threatened for 6 weeks. So here's where we land. The global economy has spent 50 years building a system that routes 20% of its most critical resource through a strip of water that can be targeted by shore-based missiles, underwater mines, and drone swarms. The backup infrastructure covers maybe a quarter of the exposure. The geopolitical tensions in the surrounding region are at multi-decade highs, and the world's institutional memory of actual disruption is long enough ago that most people in positions of power have never lived through one. This is not a prediction of disaster. It is a description of a system that is more fragile than its designers intended, maintained longer than its safety margins allow, in conditions its architects never modeled for. The oil will probably keep flowing tomorrow and the day after. But the question the world has not seriously answered is not whether the strait will close. It is what happens to an interconnected, debt-laden, just-in-time global economy. The first time it actually does. Because unlike every other crisis we have stress-tested, practiced for, and written contingency plans about, this one has never actually happened. And the first time something happens for the first time, no one is really ready.